So the other day I received a preview build for an upcoming game called Daymare 1988. And from that title alone, it probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but for someone like myself who used to follow the Resident Evil 2 Reborn project, it's actually something that's worth looking into. To give a bit of context here, Resident Evil 2 Reborn was a fan-made project where a few developers attempted to recreate Resident Evil 2, but using a more modern engine. But alongside that, they tried to reintroduce the game via a more modern format of gameplay, playing more like a game like Resident Evil 6, while keeping the charm, atmosphere and mystery of the original games. With it being a fan project, it was obviously a back burner idea for them, but from the stuff that they'd shown off on YouTube, it actually had a lot of potential and did show a fair bit of promise. But back in 2015 when the Resident Evil 2 remake was finally confirmed, this came with the predictable news of the fan project was being shut down by Capcom. Which is obviously sad at first, but what formed from that in the long run is actually something quite interesting. Instead of just packing up shop and calling it a day, the developers over at Invader Games, now known as Invader Studios, decided that they would take what they learned from making the project and make their own game out of it, and that game is going to be Daymare 1988, a third-person survival horror with heavy inspiration from games like Silent Hill and more obviously Resident Evil. So the question from here would be, from a quick play around with the preview build, what did I think? And honestly, it's not that bad. It's definitely a very ambitious project for something that started off as a remake of another game, and in a few areas this has actually paid off very well. But obviously with high ambitions, sometimes you can bite off more than you can chew, and Daymare 1988 is in a similar situation, but not entirely in a bad way. It definitely hits the nail on the head when attempting to recreate what so many players loved about the original games, and from the get-go you immediately get that feeling of an old school Resident Evil game. Within the preview build of the story, it focuses around a small cleanup crew, and within this crew you play as Agent Liev. From observation of how he acts and talks, he's a bit of a dick and no one in the crew really likes him, and honestly I can see why. They've been ordered to go to a laboratory that has currently encountered an outbreak of a virus, and their main objective is just to go to secure some samples, wipe the data clean and take out any hostiles that they encounter in the area, including civilians. Yeah, you actually have a segment right at the start of the game where it forces you to kill a civilian. It's not even a cutscene, it's actually the in-game tutorial and learning how to shoot. It's a very bizarre way to start the game, but it does set the tone and direction this game wants to take. And you know, in a weird way it actually works. Assuming we're not playing the good guys this time round, it makes a lot of sense. I just wish Agent Liev wasn't such a dick about it.
Nah, you're right. I guess I can. I mean, especially you. Oh, what the heck. I'll lend a hand.
Throughout the remainder of the preview though, you're given a rough idea of what to expect throughout the course of the main game. You've obviously got little micromanagement things like ammo, health items and key items, with the ability to combine a few different health items for different stat boosts. But if we're looking at the main aspects of this game, one thing you're bound to see a lot is the different types of puzzles this game will throw at you. You'll have a mini-game like scenario where you try to hack a door open, but obviously being a game inspired by Resident Evil, I think we both know what kind of puzzles I'm talking about. At first with each puzzle it might appear confusing, but there's enough hints within the room to give you a decent idea of what you need to do. The only one I think some players might have a few issues with is possibly the puzzle found in the founder's office with the paintings and the Greek keyboard. But that's not a bad thing. I'd rather have a puzzle feel rewarding when I finish it, rather than something I can just run through without even thinking about it. Now I think with certain players this might definitely put them off, but if you take a second to actually observe what's around you in the room, like you would in Resident Evil and Silent Hill, you should be fine. Puzzles aside though, this game has some other little mechanics that are actually quite surprisingly in depth. More specifically, I'm talking about the inventory system itself. Just like in games like Resident Evil, the inventory works to a certain limit and you can move around, combine and discard items as you please. However with Daymare, it decides to take everything one step further. Firstly, when accessing your inventory, it doesn't actually pause the world around you, meaning if infected are nearby, you might want to sort things out later. But that's not what surprised me, as things go a little bit deeper, especially when you look at how the game deals with ammo. In almost every single game out there which has a gun in it, if you pick up ammo, that's it. It's in your ammo pool and you can just carry on shooting shit and your day's good. But in Daymare, it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. In Daymare, you'll also need to have a magazine spare to actually be able to reload said weapon quickly and efficiently. And of course, you could just combine the ammo via the inventory menu, but when you're in a bit of a pickle, you won't have time to do this. Instead, you'll have one of two options. You can either hold the reload button to slowly reload your gun successfully, or you can just tap the reload button and quickly swap the mag out and drop the current magazine onto the floor, not only dropping those few bullets that you had in the magazine, but also dropping that magazine itself, meaning if you haven't found and filled another magazine, you won't be able to reload without going into the inventory menu. meaning a dire situation can just become a little bit worse if you're not careful. And honestly, I love this idea. It's such a small difference that provides a heavy impact into your strategy when in the middle of a holdout. Now thankfully you can pick that magazine back up, but obviously if there's a zombie in the way or something bigger, you can't pick it up immediately, so you've got to really think when you use that quick reload. And I think on a harder difficulty that might become a win or lose situation. At the moment though, when starting a new game you'll have two options to choose from. Daymare mode being the way the game's meant to be played, and then a beginner's mode which adds more items to find around the levels to make it more appealing to players who just want a more casual experience. Now at this current point in time, the same reload and inventory mechanics work both over on beginner's mode as well as Daymare mode, but perhaps to keep casual horror fans happy, it might be worth adjusting that reload mode for beginner's mode. Also, there is an aiming option on it which I'm not really sure what it does, but I'm assuming that's there for reviewers who don't know how to play a game. Now while all that stuff is rather great and done very well might I add, I did experience a couple of things with this preview that kinda just rubbed me the wrong way, but thankfully these weren't caused by the gameplay itself, rather it was the cutscenes, and the animations, and the faces, and more importantly the voices.
And don't worry, I'll take care of these.
Yeah, the cutscenes in this game are just a little bit underwhelming, which is a shame because it does overshadow the gameplay itself, especially when it comes to a lengthy introduction to the game. If you saw this first without seeing any of the gameplay, then yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you just stopped playing the game there and then. A mediocre introduction to a game can leave a rather lacking and bitter taste over the rest of the game you play, and could ruin a somewhat decent game altogether. Hell, if you want a prime example of this, Overkill's The Walking Dead's first level is by far the best example of how you do not begin a game. Initially, the first time I actually played this game, my audio for the cutscenes just randomly cut out for the entire experience. So I was just sitting there in silence reading the subtitles and getting confused at who was talking due to the minimal and sometimes lack of facial animations. But when I played through it a second time and finally heard the voices, yeah, I wasn't missing that much. I'm sorry and I hate to be so nitpicky, especially with an indie title, but with the kind of game that Daymare's trying to be and how frequent the characters speak in game, the voice acting needs to be a bit better than this to avoid ruining the experience. I mean, it's not even laughable like the original Resident Evil games, it's just inconsistent and rather bad and just ruins the moment. Overall though, what the game sets out to do, it does well a majority of the time, but I think in certain areas, more specifically the voice acting and cutscenes, this game is falling a bit flat. Now everything I say here has to be taken with a pinch of salt as this is a preview build to the game. The issues I've mentioned today might have already been fixed or they might possibly not have, there's no real clarification to that. But regardless of that, I personally think we're looking at a game that could possibly be overlooked at launch without some decent marketing. I only really knew about this game's existence because I followed the original Resident Evil 2 Reborn project, and then was reminded about the game's existence by someone on Discord later on. But I think for the majority of people out there, they probably just know nothing about it. But if you're one of those people yourself and you think the game does look interesting after watching this, then the only thing I really ask you to do is go and wishlist it on Steam. Also yes, don't worry, the game is coming out for PS4 and Xbox One, but from what I can see on Steam, the game is aiming for a summer release this year, but depending on how far off that preview build is compared to the build the devs are actually working on today, it might be worth pushing it back a bit just so you have a bit more time to polish the game and get it out in a decent state. Finally, I would like to say thank you again to Invader Studios for the chance to actually try this out, and I'm sorry if this is not the high praise you were after. I think you've done some remarkable things with Daymare so far, I just think it needs a bit more time in the oven before you release it. But regardless of that, I am still going to buy this game. Even though the voice acting's a bit off and the cutscenes really are not that good, the core of the game itself is bloody fun and I really enjoy shooting zombies in it. End of the day, I just like zombie games.